firmware, do proper filtering, turn off web management interfaces, and maybe block inbound port 80 on some user subnets. I've lived with that since I first got DSL. Port 80 doesn't work incoming for me. I mean, if I can live with it, the rest of us can too, right? So this is a nonprofit project. You know, I don't want to get any money for this. I want to just raise awareness about the issue of embedded systems so that you don't have to hear me constantly talking about it and we can talk about something else. Because I will talk about it until we start to affect some change. And my idea was to create a public wiki and gain community support and kind of push vendors in the right direction. By all means, if you have other ideas, I'm more than happy to hear them. You know, let's talk about them. So these are just some examples. You know, someone wrote in and said, hey, on this Buffalo router, the username that is by default is in the web page, or the password error. If you enter the wrong password, it discloses the username to you. So, you know, like you would never do that on a Windows or a Linux system. Would it come back and say, oh yeah, by the way, the username is root to log into the system? You wouldn't see that on a system, but we see it on embedded systems. How are they any different? We see some configuration leakage here, password leakage on this particular Belkin router is another example that's already on securityfail.com. So as far as my plot for world domination, it turns out there's an app for that, or maybe someone beat me to it, I'm not sure which. So things that I kind of ran out of room to cover. I mean, I got 10 minutes left. I wanted to leave time for questions. The Chuck Norris worm, I kind of touched on it briefly when I said you could create malware. It turns out that I did a little bit of analysis, and I want to get back to researching it more, that the Chuck Norris worm and the PSY bot, the PSY bot was really just a piece of Linux code that was compiled from MIPS and uploaded to run on various devices and did botnet type activity. The Chuck Norris worm that was running around was just a variant of the PSY bot. I actually tracked down the person that did the original analysis of the malware, and I have some copies of it in his full analysis. So I want to understand that more because I think we're going to see more of that kind of stuff for all the reasons that I mentioned in the presentation. There's a lot of great research going on with static device firmware. There's a blog called icysilence.org. If anyone knows the person who runs that or whatever, like I want to buy him a couple of beers, awesome research going on there. He's reverse engineering firmware and figuring out, oh, hey, look, if you log in with this username and password, it lets you log in with administrative privileges, and that's hard-coded inside the firmware. So there's a lot of people finding bugs like that too, which I think are awesome and something that's so easily avoidable. Analyzing video game systems like TiVo and Blu-ray players, which I didn't even talk about in the presentation, but your TiVo and your Blu-ray players all have connections to the internet now, and pretty soon I think, and it's already happening, your TV is going to have a connection to the internet. So those are yet even more devices. I did not talk about wireless type worms and default Wi-Fi settings. We saw all those millions of open wireless access points that still exist. A wireless worm is still, I think, a possibility. And the last thing was just, you know, segmentation is really just a Band-Aid. People say, well, we've got all these vulnerable systems and printers and embedded systems. Let's just put them over there for now. And no one will know the vulnerabilities because they're segmented on a separate part of the network. And as we all know, nothing's really truly segmented. It always has either a firewall or some device providing access to it, or someone takes a USB thumb drive and sticks it in and infects something. So I think that segmentation is just taking the problem and putting it somewhere else. Let's solve the problem at the root and get manufacturers to start doing some very basic things to improve security. So with that, are there any questions? Yes. Yeah, the question and comment was, you know, do you think that there would be a usage for a benchmark for embedded systems, similar to I have benchmarks for other things and standards for security? Absolutely. That's exactly where we need to go. You know, we can work with organizations like MITRE in the U.S., produces similar kind of standards like that. I think that's a great idea. I think that's exactly where we need to go. I think I'd like to add on to that. Maybe we need to analyze how the manufacturers are doing things and say, look, here's the standard, and here's where you are, way down there, and kind of do some public shame to get people to change. That's a good point. More questions? Oh, I think there's a question over here.
One of the things coming up is IPv6 and the Internet of Things, where everything will be directly connected on the Internet. And one of the things that has to do with the Internet of Things is that they're actually looking at security, because they thought, well, the box is behind the NAT router with the customer and doesn't connect to the Internet anyway. Do you actually see something like that, where actually the manufacturer are looking at security because of IPv6?
No, I don't see any embedded device manufacturers looking seriously at security or taking into account that like you said, and I completely agree, IPv6, everything could have a public IP address now and might be even more exposed to the Internet. I think one of the problems that we have with IPv6 now that I think is interesting is the ability to find those devices. So when you look at scanning 20 million or more, or maybe 1 billion potential IP addresses to find like 1,000 embedded systems, that can take a really long time. I think the reason I'm able to scan and find stuff is because our address space isn't that bad right now. When we move to IPv6, it's going to be gigantic. So I think that's why methods like NTP and DNS are going to be critical to finding those embedded systems. So we don't want manufacturers hiding their vulnerabilities just because IPv6 is so big. But that's a good point. Was there another question over here? There's one here. Sorry, we'll get to you if there are questions over there. Or maybe I'm just delusional. It's been known to happen.
I saw some hands.
It's lack of beer is what's happening. What's that? I went home early last night? Oh. What's that? Because of the lack of beer? No. Oh, yeah.
Paul, you mentioned...
Yes.
You mentioned the example of that router that forces you to change that password.
Yes.
It's very nice that you have this admin interface, but most of these devices are configured to work out of the box. So you plug the cables in, you put the power in, hey, it works, and nobody ever touches the admin interface again. So, yeah, how do we fix that?
Thanks for bursting my bubble. I was all excited the device let us change the default password.
Sorry.
And and you're right. A lot of the devices, they just want people to plug them in. And again, manufacturers are trying to make a cheap device. They're trying to keep their support costs down, so they don't want people to... Two things. They don't want people calling the help desk, and they don't want people telling their friends, hey, I bought this device, and then posting it online. It was a wicked pain in the ass to set up. That's a U.S. term in Rhode Island, too. It's wicked. It's a word. We'll come see me after. I'll teach you about the word wicked. It's wicked cool. Any more questions? Actually, I ended early. That never happens.
Anyone else has a question? We have time for 2 more. All right.
Not from this guy. Yes, Chris.
I had a quick question. Apparently you wrote a book about embedded devices as well. Did any of the vendors that you covered in the book ever come to you and say, you wrote a book about embedded devices, you covered our device, how can we do this better, or are they just completely uninterested in the stuff you write?
No, they completely ignore me. I think they're scared.
It's probably
really. Yeah, I've never been contacted by a vendor about any of the stuff I've talked about, and I mean I've publicly shown their devices being vulnerable in production deployment environments, and they just don't care. I think if anyone works for a vendor and does care, I'm happy to have a beer with you. Yes.
I want to raise a suggestion for the future, programming a streamer so it would transmit subliminal messages. That could be nice if you want to control the world.
In the plot to take over the world, I totally agree there should be subliminal messages. Yes. Thank you. That's a good suggestion. Yes, because like starting a cult. See, if I can get Chris to be on my side, world domination in like less than a week. He's like, I'm on board. I've had people go up to the other presentation, like, yeah, I'm on board. Let's take over the world. I'm like, no, it's just to prove a point. Anyway.
All right. One more question. Anyone?
You can check out the stuff on our podcast. We talk a lot about this stuff on our podcast. I would say I'm going to make the wiki public. I'll announce that on the podcast. I'll put it up on our blog, and I'll announce it on our mailing list as well. So if you're looking to not have me create your account for you, which you can still do if you just have something you want to talk about now. If not, and you want to wait till I open up registration on it, hit our mailing list or listen on our podcast, and I'll announce it.
Right. Paul, thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
Please give them a warm round of applause.
Thank you.